your house. And this is my the work that I've been doing on textual analysis. I really love this particular approach to work, and I particularly frame this around a master's research project. I did an accelerated master's at Ryerson in the School of Professional Communication, and I found that textual analysis was a really, really cool way through some of the data. And it really helped to kind of add a lot of dimension and certitude to the conclusions that I was making. So I'm just going to give you a quick bio about me. I'm a PhD candidate at in the Communication and Culture program. I had a previous career as a reporter. I'm a certified project manager, and I worked for years and years in a variety of companies, mostly in high tech. Since I've been working at the Collaboratory, I've gotten to do all sorts of cool things, like become a licensed drone pilot. I also make chatbots. I do virtual and augmented reality. And there's a lot of really cool things at the Collaboratory to check out. So I really encourage you, if you're not already a member, to become one. And this is how you contact me. If you have any questions after this session, what I'm going to do actually before we get started is, just like I always do with these workshops, the slides that I've created here are yours. So you can use them. We basically created them as completely open Creative Commons. They're all yours to keep. You can make a copy of this presentation and just take it out into the world with you. And I just wanted to, because I've been doing so much work in this area, and I've done some research projects on textual analysis tools, I wanted to share with you what I've discovered in terms of some of these different tools that are actually really, really fun and can really help you get through that research project if you're working on an accelerated master's or a master's or a doctoral, a dissertation. These textual analysis tools are incredibly helpful. So quickly, I just wanted to take you through a little bit of my personal history and why I gravitate so much to textual analysis. And then I'm going to give you this sort of gallery of options. There's some really cool options, browser-based open source tools that I really encourage you to check out. Then we're going to do a live demo of a tool that I actually got a training on through the Center for Digital Humanities, and I highly recommend it. It's a Canadian created tool called Spyral, and it's under the banner of Voyant Tools, created by some researchers at the University of Alberta. I love it. You'll love it too. It's so fun and it's so easy to use. And then we're going to go through some case studies of some of the research that I've done with textual analysis, just to give you a sort of sense of things. Okay, so in my past, I used to be a reporter. I was a tech reporter. And then I moved into a couple of really large multinational agencies. One of them was Hill & Knowlton, which is part of a huge multinational corporation, WPP Group, based in the UK. And then I moved to a company called Shandwick, both the largest multinational PR firms in the world. And one of the areas of specialty that I had was looking at how text messaging kind of moved out in the world. So I've been doing text analysis, sentiment analysis, tone analysis for literally decades. And one of the things that's really interesting, and we'll talk more about this as we go through some of the examples, is large corporations are doing this to the text that you put out into the world on the internet through social media. They're doing this kind of analysis on you every single day. Okay, so what I would do when I was working in these large multinationals, and then later in big multinational companies, is we were looking at things like, if you typed complaints into a chatbot or a service portal, corporations would actually go through, mine your data, and find out, okay, how's everyone feeling right now? Are they angry? Are they disgusted? Are they happy? Are they liking us? And they do this sort of deep textual analysis on you every single day. So I was actually creating corporate dashboards on that basis. And I was using tools like Radian 6, which is now part of Salesforce. Really robust tool. And it's used to kind of look at Twitter or social media, and basically look for, are certain keywords being used, or messages getting out there? How does everyone feel about a particular brand? And it's doing this kind of analysis that we're actually going to be walking through, and then you're going to be able to do after this session. And so some of these corporate dashboards would look at our, the compare and contrast between us and competitors, how competitors are viewed versus how we're viewed, the brands that we were supporting, where certain mentions were going up. And, if we had a messaging statement, say we had a tagline or a statement about a particular product, we were looking for how are those words being picked up in journalistic articles and in online chatter. And one of the things that this really helps with, if you're working with a prof or a sort of very skeptical business leader, one of the things that you're going to see a lot, and this is just a predisposition of our culture, is there's a feeling that numbers don't lie. If you process tools or process text through some of these tools, you're using technology and you're doing word counts, you're doing frequency, you're doing pickup, people tend to trust the numbers more than they trust your observations. And there's all kinds of cultural reasons for that. That's an entirely different session, but you know this from just seeing how we as a culture privilege things like numeracy and statistics. And so if you have a prof that's saying, and this is actually where I really started to focus in on textual analysis, was I had a professor that I was working with who said, I'm not really sure that that these are your conclusions. And this is what actually drove me to, really provide an empirical undergirding of my conclusions, so I could say, yeah, no, here, thud, here's my conclusions. It really, really helps with that. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So one of the example projects you're going to hear a little bit more about later is I did some work on board game rule books. And I wanted to find out an answer to a question that I had, in terms of the top ranked board game rule books, do they tend to refer to the player as he? More than they might refer to a player as she or they, which would be a best practice. And so I was trying to figure out the answer to that question. And we're going to go through that in a little bit more detail, but I was basically using some of these tools to create this giant master database of, how many times did they say he in reference to player and all sorts of other dimensions in the text. And I was processing text through a bunch of different automated tools to do that. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. And then another example is that master's research project I did for my master's, where I was actually working with designers of a specific game. It was a game for nursing, a serious game. And I was interviewing the creators of that game using a coding framework, which was something that was done by a serious game designer in the US who basically had a bunch of criteria around identity, immersion, interactivity, increased complexity, informed instruction, and instructional environment. And I was coding the interviews that I did with the people who created the game to see where their emphasis lied, where they realized they had to make certain compromises and where their emphasis in their speech about their game design process really went. So it was around game design and how they privileged certain things over other things and where they knew they were doing that. And so I actually did a count, just processing their interviews of where they put emphasis. And so this is just an example from the master's research project where I was looking at and creating a coding template. So taking a particular methodology around serious game design and then saying, okay, I'm looking for things that sound like this. If we're talking about identity, we're talking about the avatar, we're talking about relationships to that avatar, etc., and creating a coding framework to do processing. And this is a bad dude in one of the games talking about visceral interactions. So one of my favorite tools to use, and this is just a daily, day-to-day tool that I really, really like to use, is this particular tool online. And again, this presentation is yours, so you can take this and kind of go through and shop through some of these examples that I'm providing you. This particular tool is browser-based. It is super easy. There's nothing to download, and you basically can take a piece of text that you have. I used to run a Canadian content blog site called Geek versus Goth, where we would run movie reviews mainly around Canadian content. And in order to make sure that we were using a lot of word variety in our stuff, my partner and I, who launched the site, would use this tool to say, okay, am I repeating the same word too often? And it looks at things like word frequency. It looks at it. It actually lets you analyze your own writing, and it's free. It's open, and you can basically take a paragraph of something you've written and kind of process it in a very, very simple, low overhead way. The other thing that's really cool about it, this particular utility, is you can actually look at things like reading level. And that's actually a really, really interesting variable when looking at textual analysis. You can say, okay, who's this written for? You know, if you're taking something from a third-party site or you're analyzing a certain document, you can say this readability level, the Fleisch-Kincaid readability level is extremely high. And I'm going to give you an example about that in a moment. The other thing that's a really quick and easy tool to use, and again, you can do this with Adobe if you've got the full version, but you can also process text from PDF to text. This allows you to kind of, and this is what's called in the business of data analysis, you're basically cleansing your data. You're creating that data in a form that really helps you to process through some of these tools. So if you're getting stuff in a PDF, you can actually, and this is what happened to me with my board game rule books. A lot of them were available online as PDFs. I had access to some of the other board game rule books in my home. But what I was able to do is process it and then actually do very, very robust word counts. And again, this is just one example tool. There are many, many others, but allowing you to get it into plain text format and kind of clean it up after that. Now, the other thing that I really wanted to touch very briefly on, and again, this is this sort of gallery of amazing tools that you can use, is Amazon Comprehend. Now, typically Amazon Comprehend is a machine learning natural language processing tool that allows you to process large amounts of text and do things like sentiment analysis. One of the big sort of killer apps with this particular tool is doing things like redaction. So if there is personally identifying information, corporations, I used to have to do this. Part of my job was doing redactions for access to information requests. If there was, competitive information in a document or information about a supplier that we had to remove from documents for reasons of privacy, we would do that with actually more manual tools. Now, Amazon Comprehend and its sort of constellation of AI type technologies actually allows you to do that at scale. So a lot of companies use Amazon Comprehend, and I welcome you to go to all of these links after this session. You can see that they're basically doing like large scale sentiment analysis, just like I talked about. You can take a large amount of social media content and kind of process it through to find things. And typically companies are using Amazon Comprehend to do things like moderation of chats, if people are putting personally identifying information in, or that kind of thing, or probably large scale access to information redactions. This was actually a tool that I really, really liked. It's a little bit fiddly, but it's actually it's called Catma DE, and you can use it for a bunch of different processes. I actually used this for my master's research project, the accelerated master's that I did, and I was able to take my transcripts of the interviews that I did with individuals and kind of use the tool very lightly to stage it offline and count the emphasis, count the words that were being used during that interview. What's terrific about it as well is it does a lot of other things. It lets you do text annotation. So if you're working with a team, say you're working with a coding team and you're saying, okay, I want to find every instance in this particular document of references to player as he, and make sure you mark it up and count it. And then if somebody else needs to come in and kind of take over your shift and do it next, you have a really nice annotation trail. We can say, okay, Tani's done up to this section. I can see some of her conclusions. Now I'm going to get started and use the same conventions that she has. So it's a really, really robust, nice textual analysis tool. The other one that I thought about is something that the library teaches a lot, and it's such a great tool. It's called Hypothesis, and it basically allows you to annotate any text online. You can actually create a group and you can say, okay, I want to take a look at, I'm just going to make something up here, Toronto Dominion's website. And I want coders to take a look at how many times they mention the pandemic. And you can basically do a hypothesis overlay on that website. They can't see it. You're basically creating a group. And you're doing an annotation on a live site basically marking it up and saying, isn't this interesting? They've mentioned the pandemic, 15 times on this specific section that's targeted to this type of customer. So you can actually do a collaborative overlay on text online anywhere. And only you guys can see it because you're basically creating a little network of people who are invited to that specific hypothesis. And you all get to see how, I've been annotating it, you've been annotating it, and we're all making observations together with anything online. It's such a cool tool. And this is a tool I don't know a tremendous amount about, but it is something that's highly recommended around, it's sort of noted to be the competitor to CATMA, which CATMA DE that I just talked about. And it's also apparently very, very powerful and has a lot of that annotation capability. All of these tools are free and open source. And then there's Google Text and Analytics with text-to data. And in this one, you can actually do some of that sentiment analysis. And we'll have a couple of examples of that in a moment, where it's like how cranky how cranky is the writer on this particular text? Or how cranky are these little group of customers? Are they upset? Are they feeling fear? Are they feeling anger? Are they feeling joy? These are some of the dimensions that you can take a look at and see, positive, negative, neutral. And that's something that I would do when I was working in corporations to say, okay, the coverage over the last week has been overwhelmingly positive with a few neutral articles and a couple of negative ones. And then you could actually run those kinds of tools through to create dashboards for your customers. And the other really interesting thing is I make AI chatbots, which I can teach you how to do, I promise, in like 25 minutes or less. They're very, very easy tools to use. But what's also happening in the back end of a lot of these tools is as you chat with chatbots online, they're actually running things like sentiment analysis to say, okay, Tanya is very angry with her grocery delivery service or whatever, and she's sad about this particular issue, and they actually run sentiment analysis to see about the health of their customer base. The other really interesting thing, and it just happened over the last couple of weeks, is they also used to have a tool called IBM Personality Insights, which was under the IBM Watson banner, the natural language processing tool. And they've actually, what they call deprecated, it's called sunsetting in the software business. They've removed this tool from use. And I think I understand why. One of the things that they used to do is run text, any text. If you've tweeted something, if you've ever interacted again with customer service, they would actually run a personality analysis on you, okay? And it was done against the top or the big 5 personality traits, openness, neurosis, all of these different types of, are you introverted, extroverted, that sort of analysis. And they would actually run a projection of what you're most likely to buy as well. It was always off. It was always so profoundly off. It had a really interesting, I would put in some of my essay content just to see what it would bring back. And the sentiment analysis was fairly accurate, but the personality analysis was, it seemed to me, way, way off. So they've actually delisted this, but this is the kind of thing that is happening with these text analysis tools at a corporate level. They're actually doing a little bit of psychoanalysis on us. Now, this one is such a cool idea. This is not an open source tool, but it is a very, very interesting methodology. This is pronounced Luke, and it was actually created by a social psychologist whose particular specialty, James Pennebaker, was journaling for mental health. And he had this idea that, if you journaled for mental health, you could really help yourself. It was almost like self-therapy. And he took some of his early research into journaling for mental health and kind of pivoted to, let's look for some earmarks for violence, extreme agitation. And he actually created an analytic tool. This is Luke 2015. This is the most recent version. And it was basically looking for certain things in the writing that might indicate that somebody writing it might be violent, okay? And so he's basically looking at the language and its language construction and use of certain words to see if somebody was a threat. And then later this became a tech tool that is used quite significantly by Silicon Valley to do analysis. And IBM Watson and Amazon, the Amazon constellation of technologies actually use this to to psychoanalyze you, you know, consumers. And they're looking for certain types of things in the language. It's also used as a threat monitor online to see if somebody might be instigating violence. So it's a really, really interesting tool. And I bring it up because it's used by a lot of the off-the-shelf commercial tools that I've just described. And one of the interesting things, I actually made a little bit of a recipe around Pennybaker and Luke, and I was actually trying to construct a methodology within IBM Watson to figure out if somebody might have empathy. So, you know, in writing for a particular assignment that I had constructed, I wanted to figure out if there was a recipe for, you know, what that person submitting a message back to a bot, a fake person, whether or not they had empathy in their writing. And I was doing it with Luke, this particular methodology, to say, you know, are they using we words, you words, I words? And that if you do a lot of I statements, or you statements, they're very focused on status and their positionality. If there's positivity in the language, and we could have you can train the system to look for certain types of words like happy, joy, you know, satisfied. It would also look at things like categorical thinking. If you use a lot of these, those, this, a, and the, according to Luke, then you are a much more sort of categorical thinker. If you're using complex thinking, and basically it analyzes whether or not you use words like because, like joining words. If you're saying you have a phrase and you join it with because, or since, as, now, or that, the system will actually analyze you as being more intellectual. Now, I had a lot of problems with these types of analytics because they are so reductive. And I also I question the underpinning of the sort of sociological and psychological grounding. But these tools are used by corporations every single day to say, okay, you know what, you're writing me, and you seem more analytical, you seem more educated, because you're using more words like and because. And that's what corporations are using to analyze your text. And again, after this session, you'll be able to do that too. So this is a quick demo. This is Spyral under the banner of voyanttools.org. And again, you have access to this presentation. And I really want to welcome you to do this on your own. I'm actually going to cut away from the presentation right now and just take you into a live demo. And I'm just going to show you how easy it is to do. So one second, I'm just going to cancel out of this particular share, and I'm going to go to this box. And it's a really, really fun tool. I love it. And it is right here. So I'm going to start with getting started with Spyral notebooks first. Actually, I'm just going to share my screen just so I can move around. Okay. Oops. Okay, so the first thing you're going to see from that main link that I just shared with you, and hopefully you guys can see this, it's just getting started with Spyral notebooks. And it's it's really easy to use, and you can just cut and paste some of the code that they provide you in this getting started section. So it's again, very simple. It's done by two University of Alberta researchers, Stefan Sinclair and Jeffrey Rockwell. It's incredibly, incredibly robust, has so many different features, and I really, really love using it. I'm going to show you a really simple example. So getting started, literally all you have to do, if you can see this right up here, is you just hit the plus marker on this main page. So you can create a new Spyral notebook. I'm just going to go to a Spyral notebook that I've just made. Okay, so here we are. Now, I've taken some Python, but you really don't need to. You can just cut and paste the code, okay? And it actually gives you the example in the getting started section of how to do a word cloud. So I was just playing around before the session, and I love this particular example. And I actually used to use this professionally to find out if I was researching a company, where their emphasis was. So, you know, if you go to their any kind of website, and in this case, I just went to Taylor Swift's official website. I was just being goofy. But we can do any website that you can think of. But here's an example of Taylor Swift's website. So I just loaded in the main page of her website right here. So you just literally cut and paste any kind of site and you pop it into this code, and then you just run it. And how you run it is like this. You just hit this little play button right here, and this code runs. And as you can see here with Taylor Swift's website, and again, just for fun, usually there's a little bit of latency. It will build out. And you can do all sorts of really cool things with this. You have a little rocker switch here where you can actually add the number of terms that you want in your word cloud. So it just recombined it. But what's cool about this is the more a word is repeated, and you're probably all very well familiar about word clouds, is the more something is repeated, the larger that word gets. So it literally gives you a way to find out, someone's emphasis as you're investigating maybe a brand. So one other example, and again, you can just do this with almost anything. I'm going to pop in my own personal website and just see how I tick. Okay, so that's just my personal website, and we'll just see what my emphasis is here. So you literally just change up the website right there, and then you hit play. Okay, so my personal website, let's see what I am emphasizing. And again, this is actually really handy stuff when you're doing things like grants. You're working with a funding agency, you're working with a partner. It actually is a very interesting way through. So you can see that the biggest word on my site is game, and I'm a game scholar. So that makes sense. And I do a lot of work in virtual reality. So you can see that that's quite a bit bigger than everything else. And again, I can start adding more terms and see, okay, it's taking a look at my site and it's saying, store, training, games, search, candidates, I'm looking for work, teaching, etc. So you can see that this is where I'm emphasizing certain ideas on my website. And it's a really, really cool way through. And you can actually, talk when we're handing stuff in as a student or as a researcher. You can say, I wanted to look first at where their emphasis was. And this can actually help you a ton when you're trying to figure out areas of qualitative or quantitative investigation. We can say, okay, there's an overwhelming emphasis on this particular word on this particular site. What does that mean, right? So that's a little demo of Spyral. And if anyone has any, websites you wanted me to take a look at, I can take requests at this point. If anyone had any ideas. And it's okay if you don't. So you can see that this is a really nice, robust tool, and there's so many different options within Spyral to choose from in terms of text analysis. It can do a lot of different things, and it literally is a question of just going to a Spyral notebook and cutting and pasting the code that's in that getting started page right here, and then just running different experiments. And I love, love, love that you can just take an external site with this open source tool and analyze it in this way. It's very, very robust. It doesn't require any downloading of any software. It's really, really quick and off the shelf. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to go back to my presentation. And we'll just get started again with the presentation. And again, I have actually given you the code to run that particular example, so you can do it yourself. And there's the code right there, and here's the layout, just leaving that first line blank. And it's really just really basic Python. But cut and paste the code, you don't need to know how to code at all. So this was a little example of that word cloud that I did for my own site. It was very interesting. Some of this stuff actually helps you to do manual counts as well. So as much as you want to process these tools, sometimes it does require a little bit of manual intervention. So here's an example of the text analyzer with that onlineutility.org tool that I was using. And it basically just let me take a rule book that I had processed through the PDF to text conversion. I'd cleaned it up a little bit, gotten rid of page numbers and that sort of thing. And then I ran it through this tool to find out what are the top phrases in this particular rule book, how many words were there. And this was also very helpful in terms of looking at a whole corpus, a whole bunch of different texts, and seeing were there any commonalities. Was there a lot of variability in terms of word count and character count, numbers of sentences, to see how much complexity varied around these rule books. And it also then let me look at, how many times does the word he appear? How many times does the word she appear? So this is an example of that first tool that I talked about, onlineutility.org, where you can just do a text analysis in terms of word count frequency. And one of the other little research experiments I did just to sort of demo certain text tools, I did this about a year ago or a couple of years ago, was looking at Trump's tweets. It was for a research assignment around textual analysis and investigating what some of the gaps in terms of certain tool sets were. So my research questions was, Trump's tweets, simplistic, impulsive, and uncivil. It was based on an article by Ott 2016 that talked about kind of a media ecology theory, that if Twitter is the predominant communication mechanism of our time, then everyone kind of becomes like the dominant communication mechanism of that particular time. And Ott's argument was that we then become simplistic, impulsive, and uncivil. Okay, so my research question was kind of, does Donald Trump use uncivil, negative, or violent imagery in his communication on Twitter? And, was the language used simplistic? And these tools actually allowed me, this sort of network of tools that I'm sharing with you, allowed me to look at things like word frequency. And so what I did initially was I took all of the processed tweets for a 28-day period with Donald Trump's Twitter account when it was still around. And I looked at it from a word cloud perspective and found certain predominant words: military, America, country, fake, great, people. And at the time, DACA was a lot of conversation about the wall. You can see how large those words are just to see what was going on. Here's another example, word cloud, where you can see that emphasis. And again, the darkest and largest word is the word used most often, which was in this case Trump. And I took a word cloud of the words that I had identified were negative in nature. And this took a little bit more manual coding, but things like flamed, rigged, flunky, disproven, broken, troubled, cancel, frustration, evil, combat, Nazi, those types of words. And then I looked at that, and the core most predominant word in that cluster of negative words. Yes?
Sorry, I think the screen sharing isn't working.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, I was just about to chime in, and yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, you guys. I will back up. So now you can see that in this example, I was looking.
We still can't see anything.
Oh my goodness. What is happening? An error has occurred. It says, sorry, an error has occurred, screen sharing. Oh my goodness. I wonder what's going on. So sorry, guys. Well, you've got the presentation just in case there's something up. Can you see it now?
It flashed and then it disappeared.
Wow.
Like it tried to come up and then it went away. So,
oh my goodness, that is so odd.
There's also two questions.
Okay, yes.
So one is from Stephanie, who asks, do you know if this tool will also scan PDFs uploaded on a website? So for example, if you have publications uploaded to your website. Oh, now we can see the screen. Great.
Oh, weird. I've never gotten that error before. That's so strange. Oh, I'm so sorry. So, okay. This tool, can you read this? Yeah, you can. By rights, what should be happening is, and you could actually point the Spyral tool to a PDF. And by rights, what is good right now is if the PDFs are properly laid out, then they can be scanned. But some websites, and this is actually a huge issue, one of the things I used to have to do professionally is analyze whether or not someone has uploaded a properly formatted PDF document. So a lot of people, and this actually caused a huge issue with my rule books analysis, because there was a few sites where their PDFs were basically just scans. They couldn't be OCR'd. They were pictures, and then that might have been by intent. But if someone is, especially Canadian sites should be AODA compliant. They should be working for people who have screen readers. Those PDFs should be properly laid out. And if they are, you can mine them in the way that I'm describing. The worst case scenario is you can download that PDF, do the conversion like I've described with that one tool, and then run it through a text analyzer. But that would be a very interesting thing. And it's, the one other thing it's so heartbreaking to me is a lot of websites overuse PDFs. And it actually makes this kind of work quite difficult, and it's actually not compliant. If they're receiving any government money, they would be in trouble. So that's a great, great question. You can download it. Okay, so you can see the slides. Thank goodness. I'm so sorry. And is there a way to isolate the word he when a letter combination of he? That's a great question, Sandra. Such a good question. So when I was doing initial counts for he, you can put spaces around. So space, HE, and then space, and that can help to lower the results. So when I thought, the clever way that I wanted to get through this was basically just doing a search in the PDF. I thought, well, I can skip a bunch of steps and I could just do a search. But you're right. It highlights the, he and the. It highlights it in every aspect of every word when you just do a straight search. So that created a lot of issues. So I did have to process the rule books exactly like I shared, which is convert it to text, cleanse it, and then run it through that utility, the online utility.org tool to get he. And it did isolate in that instance. But I thought I could just do a Control F in a PDF and I'd be done. And no, you can't. That's because of exactly what you're describing there. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. I'm so sorry about that, you guys. I've never gotten that error before. So, I wanted to ask of this particular Twitter account, in this case, Donald Trump's, is the language used simplistic? And what kind of word frequency was there? So here's the example I was speaking about, where you can see the word fake, the word America, the word military, the word wall quite prominently. And I was running a bunch of different word clouds to see what was the emphasis. And this was the example of, I basically isolated all the negative words used in this 28-day period and found that the most predominant word used was frustration. Frustration, deadly, troubled, broken were the most prominent. And what's also really interesting is the we and the I were the most prominent words, other than a and the. So we, on, that, great, I were his most frequently used words. And I was actually a little surprised that we was greater than I. And then they was another interesting finding. So 4.3% of the words in Trump's tweets were references to death, injury, loss, errors, crime, or combat. Now, if I could afford it, I would love to run my cleansed tweet tool through the James Pennebaker Luke tool to figure out whether that meets the measure of instigation, whether it meets because he has an analytic where it looks at whether or not this is a violent instigation, whether this person is now in a state of crisis. And it would actually process the words that I would be entering in there to see if there was some kind of threat. And that would be a very, very interesting thing to do. So 296 of the 6,959 words issued by that individual during a 28-day period were references to death, injury, and violence. And so that Fleisch-Kincaid readability scale was another thing. I was trying to figure out, okay, is the language used very simplistic? And yes, it was at an 8.35 grade level, the reading level of a 13 or 14-year-old. So was it violent? Was it simplistic? Was it impulsive? The other thing that was really interesting about this finding was it had 52 exclamation marks. And you can see that you're building kind of a statistical analytic around, what is this language? What is this language like? And this sort of impulsivity could be tied to a use of exclamation marks. So again, the idea was it simplistic, impulsive, uncivil? And the answer was yes. So here's another example research that I did. I'm just going to speed up a little bit because I know we're running late on time, is how gender inclusive are the rule books found in the top 40 Board Game Geek ranked games. And Board Game Geek is a big centralized portal of repository of games. If you like board games, I encourage you to check it out. And basically what I did is I took the top 40 ranked games and I read every page of their rule books. So that was 744 pages. And then I processed them through some of these textuals. And so what I found was references to he were 73.8%. So anytime player was mentioned, it was typically referred to as he. Because this was a question that came up quite a bit in board game circles is, does this happen a lot? People would have anecdotal evidence that, every time that they mention player, they're always talking about a man. And that bugs me. So I wanted to figure out, was that true? And I found out, yes, indeed it was. References to she were 26.2%. And, references to they were it was not used often. And I basically created a scoring rubric based on this text analysis to say, here are some of the earmarks of inclusivity in terms of gender, and how did these games do? And unfortunately, with this top 40 ranked game, sort of the cream of the crop of board games, they got a B minus as an average, which is not a great score. I was expecting, given this was the cream of the crop, that it would do really, really well. Only 27.5% had every indicator of gender inclusivity that I had set out. And, I also did a visual analysis. This is kind of out of the range of text analysis to just look for images of women and images of men. And quite overwhelmingly, again, only images of men at 72.5%. So that's kind of the overview of text analysis. These are all the things I found over my, 5-year career almost in graduate school. And these are the sort of the best tools that I've discovered. Are there any questions at this point? Do you have a particular interest in certain types of research, or are you doing something that you wanted to kind of run by for a little bit of consultative perspective? Any questions from anybody? Okay, I have a couple more examples if you wanted. Yeah, so this is actually my database where I plugged in all the numbers. And you can see this is very fiddly. And, when you're doing text analysis, you're working with a lot of documentation. I did actually get my editor for Analog Game Studies, which is a terrific journal, said, can you go bigger than 40 games? Could we have the top 100? And I said, listen, processing 744 pages and doing an analysis at this level, you kind of want to keep it a little more confined, just to be able to give it its due. And you want to be able to go into each of the qualitative perspectives around each of the rule books to say, okay, here's what's really happening with this information. Because some of these numbers disconnected don't necessarily make a lot of sense. And I'm going to show you one example. The other thing that I was looking for is, were diverse teams more likely to produce a more inclusive result? So I did a kind of crosstab to say, okay, when the designer and the production team were all white men, did they make an inclusive rule book? And this is just a small microcosm. And I found that only games made only by white men produce rule books that had a 2.8 out of 4 inclusive rule book, whereas BIPOC men who created these games got a 3.25, and white women who created these games got a 3.5 out of 4. So it's a very small data set, but it's interesting how it kind of gives you a clue that if you have a more diverse team creating something, they're much more likely to pay a little bit more attention to issues of inclusion, which I thought was a really interesting finding. Okay, any other questions? Spatial analysis. Oh, cool.
Oh, good, you saw it, never mind.
Yeah, text-based tools that have locational data. That's a really interesting question. So what are you thinking of doing here? Is this something where it's spatial analysis within a book? How often certain references appear?
Hi, Tanya, Stephanie here. Yeah, I did a textual analysis of where ecological studies have been done, for example, around the world.
Cool.
And I had to link up the address information to a whole table that I had of country names. Okay. And it was kind of a very arduous and complicated analysis, but I hope they get more simpler, because often when you publish a paper, you don't have to say where the study was done. But I really would like to see that, and I was wondering if there are any tools, online tools that have gone that direction.
I'm actually doing a similar project. I'm working with, it's an eCampus Ontario project where they're trying to do a similar thing. And you actually can do something with H5P, that open source tool, where you can do almost like a heat map over a map. And there's a couple ways through, actually. So what you could do is you could create a map of the globe, just a static image. And then you could create heat maps or clickable areas around the globe. It's like a transparent overlay over that map. And then you could have, you know, a deep dive interactive underneath that heat map. So you can say, here's all the studies that were done in Canada with their location. And then you could provide a deep dive into the documents and the materials and your findings over that heat map. I don't know if that's what you're thinking about, but that's we're working on something similar right now, where it's a transparency, it's an overlay over a static map image, and then we would have builds on it.
Oh, neat.
And it's totally possible in H5P. It's very simple.
H5P. Okay, I'll check that out. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really good question. And yeah, there's a lot of things like that that you can do. One of the examples as well, I don't know if this is helpful to everyone, but I just did it recently, and it's another open source tool where it's a timeline. It's used by a lot of news outlets. And what I was doing was trying to take time-based data and kind of create an approach to putting that time-based data into something that looks a little bit more it was just a little bit easier to navigate. So it was a kind of a longitudinal, and it was me creating essentially a timeline of women board game designers and saying, okay, over time, over these particular years in history, you know, what has been happening. And I'll just show you an example of it right now. And it's another really cool, it's actually based on Google Sheets, completely open source. And again, it's something that the New York Times uses, a lot of news outlets uses. It's completely open source, and it lets you share longitudinal data in a really, really interesting way. So I'm going to just show you this right now. And hopefully you'll be able to see it without a problem. Okay. And it's actually called JS Timeline. And I'll send that out in the chat as well. Okay, so I'm just going to pop this open for you. Up, up. So there's a lot of different ways to display your findings. And you can do it with that heat map idea. You can do it with, oh, sorry. Sharing hates me today. It's my Achilles heel. Okay, so here is just an example of how to display the data in a way that might be a little bit more interesting. So this is some longitudinal data, and again, not really textual analysis, but a way to display certain text findings. So this is me basically writing an essay, and again, hopefully you can see this, where I'm looking at, you know, over time, women in board games. And I took, you know, Creative Commons pictures, and took some of my research and basically input it into this kind of format. And it's, again, a longitudinal way to display some of your data and your findings. And I bet you didn't know that Candyland was designed for kids in hospitals suffering from polio, but they were. It was a really interesting backstory. And a lot of this information doesn't exist in particularly robust ways online. So it was a way to kind of go through some of this data using these open source tools to kind of share this information more widely. The person who designed Jenga, it was a woman, it was a huge trailblazer in the toy industry, and I didn't know that history. And then, you know, this larger game, you see this particular brand in a lot of kids stores, Think Fun. This particular individual, Andrea Barthelo, is a huge influence on like kids' toys and designs. So again, hopefully you can see that. Can you see the timeline that I'm showing, or no?
We can see the page, the WordPress page, but not the link. There's also just another question in the chat from May.
Is there a way for compare? Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things that that I did, I created a document to go along with this session, and I will share this out with you as well, May. We can send it out afterwards, and it's basically me analyzing various different tools and kind of talking about whether or not they're open source or not. And so, yeah, I can basically everything I've shared with you today, with the exception of that Luke tool, is completely free, open, and often browser-based. So I'm going to try that one more time. I'm so sorry, you guys. Okay, so this was that timeline I was speaking to, but you couldn't see. So it's basically another little cool open source tool where you can basically take information and display it over a timeline, over a longitudinal timeline. So this is me taking some of my research, and again, hopefully you can see this. And you can, see that I'm taking some of the Creative Commons content and I'm displaying it here. And this is literally just Google Sheets and this tool. And I will send out the link to everybody if you're interested. It's really simple to use. You just plug in stuff in Google Sheets and you hit process, and it makes this really, I think, quite pretty timeline where, you learn a little bit about the history of Candyland, which is a game that's often disparaged, but was actually created by a woman who had polio herself as a kid and wanted to create a game that took kids' minds off being in hospital. And these trailblazers in game design. So that's an example of a tool that you can use to kind of display some of your findings. So it's a time-based tool rather than a map-based tool, but that H5P heat map tool that I'm talking about is very, very simple to use. And maybe what I'll do is I'll pop, May, to your really good question, a couple of these examples in as well in that document, and I'll share it out with the team. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. So any other questions? I'm sorry about the sharing hiccups. And if you're struggling with text analysis, what I find is just trialing and error, like brute forcing it is what I tend to do, to sort of play around with these tools. Again, they're free, they're open, they're often browser-based, and super easy to use. I know it's a lot, isn't it, Jared? I motored through a whole bunch of stuff, but this presentation is yours, and I'm going to basically give to Christina that background document that I created, which was my own research. And if it's helpful to you, I can definitely share that with everybody, because I had to do my own kind of investigation to see which one works, what's better, what's not as good. But great question from May.
Yeah, you'll be getting the presentation link and the background link that Tanya just mentioned. I'll email that this afternoon to everyone, just in case.
And I can also send you some links to my example research, because I find it's really helpful to have that background example. When I was doing